Great to have standing room only, isn't it? That's a big tribute, Dr. Tribe. So it's wonderful to welcome you today, to welcome the members of our student body, our faculty emeriti, our alums, all here in good numbers. And it's a special privilege for me to welcome especially Lawrence Tribe, Professor of Constitutional Law and the Carl Loeb University Professor at Harvard. He is certainly widely recognized as a prominent leading scholar of constitutional law, and we're delighted that he's here. Dr. Lenore Martin, our Louise Doherty Wyant Professor and a preeminent scholar in Middle Eastern studies, will be introducing Dr. Tribe. And one of the joys I have to tell you of knowing Lenore is that you also have the amazing opportunity of meeting her friends. So over the years, especially the people up front here, I have met through Lenore. And I'm also happy to say that many, many years ago, I had the privilege of joining Lenore to meet Larry Tribe at an earlier meeting, and he asked me, so well, which one was it? I said, I really don't remember. I just know that I was with Lenore at one of your addresses. So I'm going to call Lenore up to do a good introduction of our keynote speaker this evening.
I'm really thrilled to have the honor of introducing Professor Lawrence Tribe to you today. As Sister Janet said, Professor Tribe is the Carl Loeb Professor, University Professor, and Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard University. The title of University Professor is the highest honor a Harvard professor, Harvard tenured professor can receive at Harvard. There are only 24 today, and there have only been 72 in the history of the university. So we are among the elite today. I met Professor Tribe in the spring of 1974. I was working on a piece of legislation called the Rape Shield Law at that time. I was a volunteer with the National Organization of Women. In 1974, a rape victim, it was usually a she, not always, but if a rape victim reported a case to the police, and the case was taken to court, the rape victim's past sexual history and her reputation in the community was brought in as evidence in the case. And that turned into a very searing experience, and most women would therefore not bring a case of rape to the courts, because just to avoid that kind of terrible experience. Because what they were trying to do, of course, was to discredit her testimony. So the Rape Shield Law would not allow that kind of prejudicial evidence to be brought into the trial. So I introduced the bill to change that law at a hearing before the Judiciary Committee at the State House. And one of the people that spoke at the same hearing was a Harvard Law Review student, and he questioned the constitutionality of the bill. I knew he was wrong. And so did the two interns who were working with me, two Emmanuel College interns who were working with me. So I taught at Emmanuel the next day was classes, and so the second day after that hearing, I went to Harvard Law School. I basically walked into Professor Tribe's office. His door was opened. I knocked and walked in and said, "My name is Lenore Martin, and I'm with the National Organization of Women." And then I just went into the whole history of what had just happened at the State House. And Professor Tribe just sat there, and he let me, tell the whole story, sat and he listened. And then when I was finished, he said to me, "I told that Harvard Law Review student that the bill was constitutional. What can I do for you?" And he did plenty. And the Rape Shield Law passed a few years later. And that is Professor Tribe. He's open, he's brilliant, and he's ready to fight for justice. Without that trio of characteristics, I should say with that trio of characteristics, Professor Tribe has impacted the law and civil liberties in our country more than any other legal scholar today through his arguments before the court, friend of the court briefs, briefs accompanying legislation to Congress, and through his scholarly writings that are read and cited by judges throughout the country and justices of the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court alone, he has fought to protect the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, and he's championed the rights of free press, the rights of women, racial integration, gay rights, migrant worker rights, the rights of people to sue cigarette companies, the rights of the urban poor, and we cannot forget the Bush v. Gore case. Professor Tribe has received 10 honorary degrees and a multitude of accolades for his brilliant insights, which shine through, first, his writing, where his treatise on constitutional law is cited more often than any other legal text or treatise in the 20th or 21st century. Second, in his classroom, where he has consistently been one of the most popular, if not the most popular professor at the law school. It's almost impossible to get into his classes. Third, in the appellate courtrooms across the country, and as I quickly outlined before the Supreme Court. For those of you who think, you have to have a clear idea of exactly where you will be going when you choose a major. Let me share an important, where you're going to go for the rest of your life, right? Let me share with you an important tidbit from Professor Tribe's fascinating biography. He graduated with a BA, summa cum laude, from Harvard, with a major in mathematics, and spent 5 summers as a research associate in mathematical physics and computer science at the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley, California. He is also a gifted artist. Upon graduating magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, he clerked in the California Supreme Court and then in the U.S. Supreme Court. And to show how fast and prescient is his mind, Professor Tribe taught the first course on environmental law at Harvard and wrote the first book on the subject. When Barack Obama attended Harvard Law School, he served as Professor Tribe's research assistant. An appreciative President Obama appointed Professor Tribe the first senior counselor for access to justice in the Department of Justice. There, Professor Tribe created the office to help provide access to legal services for the poor and middle-class people in this country. The timing of this lecture could not be more appropriate, as the Supreme Court has just convened this Monday for its 2011-2012 term. Its docket is full of major criminal and First Amendment issues, and may even include health care. We'll see. It's a phenomenal time to have the preeminent legal scholar and practitioner in the country to speak to us on the challenging question of what our Constitution will mean in 2037. I give you Professor Lawrence H. Tribe.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sister Janet. Thank you all for being here. That was way too generous, Lenore. It's the sort of introduction that my father would have loved and that my mother would have believed. And coming from someone of your amazing accomplishments, it's truly gratifying. And I have to say, it's wonderful to have had your very close friendship for all of these 37 years. Thank you. This afternoon, I want to talk to you about our Constitution, which is the oldest written national constitution on earth. And picking the year 2037, a quarter of a century from next year's presidential election, to focus on what kind of constitution we're going to have a generation from now was frankly arbitrary, although the number appealed to me because that's the year our Constitution will celebrate its 250th birthday, which struck me as a nice round number. But if I were wearing my hat as a math nerd, I probably would have picked a half century later, the year 2087, the Constitution's 300th birthday, because both 2087 and 1787, the year the document was drafted in Philadelphia, happened to be prime numbers. I don't know if they planned it that way, but it worked out. And it worked out in more ways than one. But this afternoon, it's my day job, rather than my occasional fascination with mathematics, that preoccupies me. And my day job for the past few decades has been all about the dynamics of constitutional meaning and how that meaning evolves. The fact that it has evolved brilliantly over the past couple of centuries is indisputable. Vice President Biden put it well in his Constitution Day lecture last month at the University of Delaware. Under this Constitution, he reminded his audience, we settled a vast continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, mobilized millions of men to unite the nation and end slavery, ascended like the mythical phoenix from the ashes of the Great Depression, turned back despotism and preserved a free Europe in 2 world wars, won the Cold War, and became a beacon of opportunity and innovation for the world. Exactly. What a marvelous trajectory our Constitution has enabled our nation to follow. Not by marking a precise path to progress, but by empowering us to create that path for ourselves, with setbacks now and then, but on the whole, with growing respect for human rights along the way. And never has our Constitution been more front and center in the news, with all sorts of groups claiming to know its authentic meaning, often challenging the very Americanism of those who dare to read it differently. Those kinds of claims, often voiced with a scary certitude, are cause for concern about where we are heading as a nation. And I imagine all of you are here this afternoon because you share some of that concern. Concern about where our nation and our Constitution, the basic framework for our nation's political structure, its system of justice, and our fundamental rights might be heading over the next generation or so. Now, I certainly can't pretend to have any crystal ball on the subject. As Yogi Berra once observed, predicting is hard, especially the future. And predicting is particularly treacherous when the Constitution's meaning changes with the changing times, even in the absence of any alterations in the written text, a process that you all know has shaped our Constitution from the beginning. Well, all of you know that in theory, but appreciating the point in practical terms is another matter. So let me emphasize what I'm saying here. Even if not one single word in the Constitution's text will have changed a quarter century from now between 2012 and 2037, it will be a different set of political actors, including a differently composed Supreme Court, interpreting the document in an inevitably different social and cultural context that largely determines the operative meaning of much of our Constitution's deliberately open-textured language. For example, the language that defines Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce in coping with topics like health insurance and consumer and investor protection, and the language that limits the power of government to restrict liberty, ignore equality, and take life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The validity of national health insurance reform and securities regulation, of the Federal Reserve System, even Social Security and unemployment compensation, depends entirely on such ambiguous and open-ended language. And it's a set of equally slippery terms that limit the power of government at all levels to do things like ban first-term abortions, or even outlaw birth control, put people to death, ban same-sex marriage, track your movements around the state by attaching a GPS to your car without a warrant, or engage in secret surveillance of every email and every cell phone conversation in America. I wonder how many of you focused on the fact that apart from just 6 relatively marginal constitutional amendments dealing with presidential election and succession, congressional compensation, poll taxes, and the voting age, not a word of the text of our Constitution has changed over the past 6 decades, from 1951 to 2011. Not a single word. Yet over that same 6-decade period, the meaning of the Constitution, as interpreted and enforced by the courts, as applied by the government as a whole, and ultimately as understood by the general public, has changed profoundly. As we entered the 1950s, before anybody here, I think, or almost anybody was born, our Constitution was I know some of you were, but I'm being complimentary. Our Constitution was understood by most people, and certainly by our judicial system, to permit racial segregation by law in public schools, to support the criminalization of interracial marriage, to uphold government control of every aspect of a woman's reproductive life, to endorse government suppression of political dissent, to allow official prayers in public schools, to permit the use of coerced confessions and illegal searches to obtain convictions and put people to death. And I could go on. There's a long list. But precisely the same constitutional text today, in every relevant respect, is understood to forbid every one of those practices. Without a single relevant change in constitutional language, the legal framework that we take for granted now treats those practices as constitutionally unthinkable. In fact, judicial nominees who would openly support such practices might be tough for even a rightward-leaning president to identify, much less for any currently plausible Senate to confirm. And if we shift our focus for a moment from individual rights against government to the powers of government to mitigate the rigors of private profit maximization, to give capitalism a human face, we find exactly the same phenomenon. From the late 1890s to the mid-1930s, the Constitution's 10th Amendment was officially deemed and widely understood to prevent Congress from enacting the Social Security system and the National Labor Relations Act and the whole social safety net now known as the New Deal. And until around 1937, the Constitution's 14th Amendment was understood to prevent states and municipalities as well from setting minimum wages, maximum hours, barring child labor, and terrible working conditions. And yet not a word of the Constitution addressing these socioeconomic matters has changed since those dark days. In truth, not a single word addressing these matters has changed since shortly after the Civil War, except maybe the 16th Amendment, which empowered Congress as of 1913 to tax incomes without apportionment among the states. And yet the constitutional landscape affecting all these matters has changed completely. From the mid-30s until the 1990s, the Constitution was interpreted by most people, including the U.S. Supreme Court, to leave both Congress and the states almost entirely free to regulate social and economic conditions as long as certain personal or civil rights were respected. And although the understanding that shaped congressional power shifted ever so slightly in the direction of what a lot of people call states' rights in the 1990s, virtually no one today questions the constitutional authority of states and localities, at least, to regulate the workplace, or the constitutional authority of Congress to regulate banking and insurance and manufacturing, or to use its spending power to effectuate national policy. I say virtually nobody, but I can't quite say nobody, because I recently debated a very distinguished law professor at the Manhattan Institute in New York City on the constitutionality of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, a measure whose detractors like to call Obamacare. I don't know what's wrong with Obamacare, but they think that's a negative epithet. And it was bracing for me to see just how far that professor, Richard Epstein, formerly of the University of Chicago Law School and now of NYU Law School, was prepared to go in arguing not just that Obamacare is obviously, in his view, unconstitutional, but that the real Constitution, properly understood, has been systematically misunderstood and violated ever since the early 1800s, when Chief Justice John Marshall began to interpret it, mistakenly, according to folks like Epstein, to authorize Congress to do such radical things as establish a national bank and ban conspiracies and restraint of trade and otherwise oversee the nation's economy. Epstein's Constitution, and he's not alone, would demand a vastly smaller national government and vastly less state and local protection of all of us, of employees and of consumers from overreaching by business. It would strike down not just Obamacare, but Romneycare, and a lot else besides. Now, those who would go as far as Professor Epstein are today viewed by most legal scholars as, frankly, a little bit off the wall. Constitutionality of the basic federal safety net and of state and local business regulation is still taken for granted among most educated people for the time being. I say for the time being because in this realm, what goes up can go down. It is entirely possible that constitutional interpretations that the vast majority of Americans have treated as all but axiomatic for 3/4 of a century or longer could be turned back by social and political movements whose battle cry is to denounce all of those interpretations as treason, as a betrayal of the Constitution's original meaning. And eventually, there might be a majority of Supreme Court justices who share that perception. The ebb and flow of constitutional interpretation may, I use the word may deliberately, bring back what the leaders of these movements regard as the true Constitution, what some of them call the Constitution in exile. And if that transpires, then the next generation of Americans, including some of you in this hall, to judge from how young a lot of you look, will grow up in a nation whose fundamental law is authoritatively interpreted to say that each human being is indeed an island, and that the safety net constructed ever since the New Deal was built of illusory ropes. Maybe not a Ponzi scheme, but an illusion. What goes up can go down. It's not just a law of physics, it's a rule of human affairs. Now, the meaning and practice of the open-ended language defining the boundaries of government power at all levels, as well as the outer reaches of congressional authority and federal executive power, are determined not simply by the language of the Constitution, but by a social and cultural climate whose contents are shaped by our national conversation about the meaning of the Constitution, conversation whose most authoritative expression is found in the decisions of the Supreme Court, a court to which either a re-elected President Obama or a newly elected President Romney or President Perry will in all likelihood nominate the successor to the already frail Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who turns 80 right after the next presidential inauguration, at a time when Justice Clarence Thomas will not yet have turned 65, and when Chief Justice Roberts, another of my former students, will still be in his 50s. But who's counting? The plain truth is this: what might actually matter the most in shaping the Constitution's future are not just the things we tell one another that we think the Constitution should be understood to mean, but seemingly unrelated things, like the state of the economy in Greece and Italy and Spain, and the unemployment numbers next summer and fall, or whether people think we're in a double-dip recession by the time they go to the polls next November, because those concerns will powerfully shape the outcomes of the coming elections. Those outcomes will in turn make a huge difference for the simple reason that the people whom a new president would nominate to sit on the Supreme Court, and the nominees that a new Senate, a Senate containing a Scott Brown or one containing an Elizabeth Warren, for instance, would either confirm or reject. That'll play a major role in the process of giving the text authoritative meaning, and of course, as you know, new justices tend these days to serve for decades, well beyond the terms of the presidents who appoint them to the bench. So remember, whoever is confirmed to sit on the court in the next couple of presidential terms will be casting votes crucial to the meaning of the Constitution and the content of our lives. In the key decisions, many of them 5-4, on the meaning of Congress's constitutional powers and of our constitutional rights, well past 2037. And that's assuming we'll still have a Constitution whose text at least reads roughly the way it does today. But even that assumption is one that might not hold. If those who want to call a second constitutional convention have their way, It's anybody's guess what the Constitution's words might say in 2037. A couple of weeks ago, Harvard Law School sponsored a conference on a new constitutional convention. It was a conference that included Tea Party activists as well as people of every other ideological stripe. But it wasn't only folks from the Tea Party and the right end of the political spectrum who urged that we begin anew, drafting a new constitution and hoping for the best, rather than make do with the admittedly rickety 1787 document that structures our political system today. Some of my friends and colleagues on the left were equally supportive of starting afresh, taking our chances with a new constitution. Exciting, mostly because of admittedly undemocratic and frankly crazy structures that are hardwired into the Constitution that we were bequeathed by the 18th century framers, structures like the weird electoral college and the literally unamendable equal representation of the states in the Senate, 2 for Wyoming and 2 for California. And, for that matter, the First Amendment's green light for financial and corporate manipulation, if not downright domination of the political process. People on the left find that distressing and think, since you're not likely to get Congress to propose an amendment to change it, why not have a constitutional convention? Now, I'm teaching courses at Harvard these days on the slippery topic of thinking about the Constitution. And among the things we're looking at is the way some of our states, like New York State, ask their citizens every couple of decades or so to vote by referendum on whether to rewrite their state constitutions in whole or in part. It's a practice that Thomas Jefferson thought the United States as a whole should follow every 20 years. And he's no slouch. That authority counts for something. And we're looking at how some countries, ranging from France and Holland to Iraq and Kenya, have recently asked their people to vote on new constitutional arrangements. Iceland, whose parliament was established back in 930 AD, recently decided to rewrite its entire constitution on the internet, crowdsourcing ideas from all of its 320,000 citizens with the help of social media like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. It's fascinating. Now, 300 million is a little different from 320,000, but who's counting? Some of us, me included, find ourselves reluctant to take that gamble with the American Constitution. And we're asked, is it because we're not really Democrats with a small d? We're afraid of what government that isn't just of the people and for the people, but truly by the people would mean? Or is it that we think our nation may just have been lucky enough, with the help of folks like Madison and Hamilton and Franklin and George Washington, don't see too many of them around these days, to stumble on a form of government by the people that does not require putting our fundamental law up for grabs all at once, whenever we see flaws in the system that we've been bequeathed. In fact, probably the most remarkable thing about our constitutional project is that it facilitates evolutionary renewal without revolutionary discontinuity, that it facilitates transformation without risking the whole enterprise at any given moment in our history. In a sense, we are rewriting our Constitution on the internet every day through a dialogue every bit as lively as the one in tiny little Iceland, a dialogue that gradually shapes and reshapes public perceptions of what our fundamental law means. The perpetual project of fashioning and refashioning ourselves into we the people is one in which we continually learn from our own adventures and misadventures and make adjustments to reflect what we've learned. Otto Neurath, an Austrian writer of the Vienna Circle, offered the evocative image of sailors who must reconstruct their ship on the open sea, unable ever to start afresh from the bottom, but fated to use the old beams and driftwood to reshape the ship while using whatever remains for support as old beams are taken away. But it's one thing to rebuild the ship while we sail uncharted waters. It's quite another deliberately to sink the vessel's scaffolding while we hope to remain afloat long enough to construct a new boat altogether. Even as I reject that bet the Constitution strategy as an unacceptable gamble, I want to emphasize that I am not, and never have been, an advocate of freezing the Constitution in mid-course, as though some of us, some magical elite, have discovered in the American Constitution of this or any other era the best of all political and legal worlds. I've long believed that fundamental debates over constitutional meaning necessarily involve episodes in an unsettled enterprise rather than the search for a long-lost key that unlocks the secret of some ultimate constitutional truth. The more I study it, the less confident I am that I understand its best interpretation. Put simply, I've long believed that the Constitution is a verb. It's what propels we the people. It constitutes the spirit of the intergenerational process whereby the Constitution's deliberately open-ended terms are subject to continuing debate, deliberation, and reinterpretation, not just by folks wearing black robes and wielding gavels. They're not the only ones who get to interpret it, but in the halls of Congress, in the White House, in town hall meetings, in countless local and national conversations among ordinary people, in lecture halls like this one, on street corners, and yes, in social media like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. I celebrate the process of civic engagement by which that continuing debate, a debate that I am as prepared to lose as to win, but a debate that nobody ever loses or wins permanently, helps each generation to make the Constitution its own. In that debate, some people will continue to insist that the Constitution continues to mean just what those who wrote and ratified its language had in mind generations ago. Others will continue to insist that the document's authors and ratifiers intentionally chose and approved language so broad that only the system's general outlines and principles were set in stone. The dispute between those two schools of thought is often miscast as a dispute between people who believe in preserving the Constitution's original meaning and those who feel free to read its language in altogether new ways in order to bring it up to date and keep it in step with the times, between a dead and a living Constitution. I'm here to tell you that's not so. The real dispute is between different forms of originalism, with some people, like Justices Scalia and Thomas, sincerely insisting that the Constitution's central aim was to pin matters down as specifically as possible so as to resist the winds of disastrous or decadent change. And with other people, like me, insisting that the Constitution's central purpose, originally, from the beginning, was to facilitate transformation and growth, and that the original meaning of all except the Constitution's narrowest and most mechanical, hardwired provisions, like the age of the president and the number of senators per state, was and remains a meaning expressed at the level of overarching principles rather than fixed and determinate rules, so that the task of putting flesh on the Constitution's bones of liberty and equality, and on things like the power of Congress to regulate commerce among the several states, that task remains inescapably our own. The debate over original meaning goes on. I've written an article about it called America's Constitutional Narrative for the January 2012 issue of Daedalus. And this isn't the time or the place to delve deeply into that debate, and besides, there's a reception afterwards. But I thought it was important to reference it just to make clear that in describing my fears about what our Constitution might become, I am not backing away an inch from my endorsement in decades of teaching and writing and arguing cases of an evolutionary process of constitutional interpretation. A process in which citizen activists and people from all walks of life play a proper role along with so-called constitutional experts. The Constitution, as the great Chief Justice John Marshall and the even greater President Abraham Lincoln both insisted in two formative eras in our nation's history, is not just a lawyer's document meant to be read and dissected and construed as though it were an arcane and technical tax or securities code. What makes it a document for ordinary people and a document for the ages worthy of our fidelity, is that even though its original version, as drafted back in 1787 and ratified over the next couple of years, was the product exclusively of white, propertied males, many of whom were slave owners, it has been fought over and transformed and made ever more inclusive over the generations, so that increasingly it is indeed a document of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I don't shrink from that process, even though I see the sad places it might lead us. I'm not about to become a fair-weather constitutionalist, ready to abandon the enterprise when it yields outcomes that I view as profoundly unwise, as with decisions like Citizen United, or a possible decision, not likely but possible, invalidating Obamacare, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Now, this is not a sermon directed just to those who might happen to share my particular views of what kind of constitution we ought to have. The views that led me, for example, to testify against the confirmation of Robert Bork as a Supreme Court Justice, and to support the nominations of Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy, and of my former student and research assistant, Elena Kagan. Views that would have led me, if I hadn't been just a kid at the time, to support the nominations of justices like William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall. This isn't a sermon just to people like me. To those who yearn instead for a return to the Constitution in exile, that more conservative Constitution, in which abortions may be banned, official prayer may be restored to public schools, and Social Security, as well as Obamacare, may be struck down in the name of the 10th Amendment. To them, I say this: it's important for you to argue coherently and respectfully for your conservative positions, and to work toward a presidency and a Senate that would seek out and confirm judicial nominees with views that would incline toward that kind of rightward-leaning Constitution. But it's also important for you to accept, for the time being, the legitimacy of an alternative vision, should it prevail in that ongoing struggle. It's important for you not to demonize your opponents as un-American, not to act as though your version of the Constitution is the only one that a patriot could embrace. Just so, to those whose views lean more to the constitutional left, either socially or economically, I say this: it's crucial to explain and argue your ideas coherently with a view to persuading your opponents rather than dismissing them as greedy, ignorant, or crazy. To work toward a presidency and a Senate that would seek out and confirm judicial nominees who are likely to see the Constitution through lenses more akin to your own. As the title of Doris Kearns Goodwin's marvelous book on the Lincoln presidency so perfectly suggests, while we may be a team of rivals, we should be a team, and a team always striving through a civilized and orderly dialogue to shape our national destiny in the image that best captures what we view as the better angels of our nature. Now, I don't mean to suggest that no more direct and potentially immediate paths through the cacophony of democracy can shape the Constitution's future. Focusing the public debate over the Constitution's meaning on future presidential and Senate contests and on the nomination and confirmation battles to which those contests will give rise is one way to do just that. Amending the Constitution and its text is another. Now, it's notoriously and deliberately difficult to do that, but I think it's worth working, for example, toward an amendment that would restore the ability of Congress and the states to regulate corporate influence over the election of candidates for public office. An amendment that would roll back what some of us think is the profound damage to democracy that the Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment did in the Citizens United case. That's why I've been working with members of Congress who have just a few days ago introduced such an amendment, H.J. Res. 78, which would overturn Citizens United without undermining freedom of the press or giving the government dangerous power over the content of the messages that people can disseminate. But I'm a realist. I've got no illusions about the ease of getting any such amendment through Congress. In Congress, many of the people voting it up or down hold the positions they do precisely because of the influence of corporate money. How likely are they, without a lot of public pressure, to change the rules that got them where they are? And I have no doubt it would be really difficult to get any such amendment ratified by the required 3/4 of the state legislatures, a system in which any 13 states, the 13 smallest ones, can block the ratification of an amendment. Again, corporate money is bound to play a large role in the lobbying of state lawmakers who are going to be voting on ratification. But I'm not ready to give up the ghost on overturning Citizens United by a congressionally proposed constitutional amendment, given the overwhelming popular support that exists for such a step. I'm certainly not ready to throw in the towel and conclude that we should launch a second constitutional convention at which heaven knows what other changes might be proposed to the states. People say, oh, don't worry, not to worry. Article 5 says that some crazy amendment can be stopped by any 13 states, sure. And the Articles of Confederation similarly said that nothing proposed in Philadelphia could become law unless all of the 13 states unanimously approved it. But they changed that rule. They said, no, 9 will be enough. What's to stop a new convention from saying, well, we're going to have a referendum of the American people, or a majority of the states will do? In fact, I'm not even ready to give up on my long-nurtured hope of eventually bringing about a constitution that, like other constitutions, modeled on ours, but moving in a more progressive direction, enshrines not just negative rights, like rights against government censorship, but positive rights, like rights that demand national legislative movement within the limits of available resources toward universal health care and housing and nutrition and employment opportunity, rights that FDR described in 1944 as part of a second Bill of Rights. Those were rights that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 proclaimed to be the prerequisites of a decent democratic society. They're rights that a few progressive national courts, most prominently the Supreme Court of South Africa, have been engaged in enforcing over the past decade or so. Equal protection of the laws, after all, means relatively little if the equality guaranteed is merely formal. It's an equality of the kind that Anatole France bitterly decried when he spoke of the majestic equality of French law, which forbids rich and poor alike to beg in the streets and sleep under the bridges of Paris. Well, just as I said earlier that what goes up can go down, let me close on what is for me a more positive note. What goes down can go up again. After all, our Constitution was pronounced in the name of we the people, and its proclaimed purpose was to form one of President Obama's favorite phrases, both when he was a student and now, a more perfect union. Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. It was to those noble ends that we did ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And it's toward those noble ends that I would encourage each of you, whatever your views may be of what makes some ends noble and others ignoble, to work. When Martin Luther King said that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, I guess some people thought he meant that it would bend in that direction all by itself. It won't. It will take struggle. It will take leadership. It will take sacrifice. It will take what Winston Churchill in a different context called blood, sweat, and tears. And above all, it will require us to ask ourselves and one another, in forums just like this one, just what kind of a people do we want to be? What kind of a nation do we want to have? What kind of moral universe do we want to construct and bequeath to our posterity? Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Questions and answers? Thank you.
What can I say? I'm sort of speechless. It's rare to catch me speechless, as you know, Larry. It was a great talk. It was a challenge. It was a challenge to us as citizens of this country, as citizens of the world today. And I'm going to open the floor for questions and call you as I see your hands. And we have 15 minutes before we'll all go over to the Fenway Room for a reception, and you can have a more personal discussion. I have to say, I love the idea of the Constitution as a verb, especially if it's moving in my direction, Larry. May I open the floor? Please. Would you identify yourself, Professor, this is a request of Professor Tribe, that just quickly identify yourself, your name.
And maybe stand up and really project.
Because we've got a big group here.
My name is Mikel, and I was just wondering, since you were talking about interpretation, do you think that with the change of an economic system, would that affect the interpretation of what laws might be to the suiting of the government?
Well, you mean if we
if there was a change in the economic system, like say there was more of a capitalist view and more of a capitalist approach to how the government's run, would that change the civil liberties that are approached in the Constitution?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think everything necessarily impacts how people look at the Constitution. That is, if we were to move toward a kind of absolutely capitalist system, which we've never had. I mean, we always had the government building railroads, and there have always been subsidies for certain industries. But if we move toward a completely capitalist system, that would be bound over time to affect people's understanding of what it's appropriate for the government to do. And I imagine that over time that would be reflected in constitutional interpretation. Similarly, if we were to move toward a system in which government were much more muscular and played a much larger role in rescuing people, that might have an impact. But it's not so much the reality on the ground that has an impact. It's sort of the culture. It's what people come to think the legacy of the country means. And often that pushes back against the economic or social changes of the time. So that it would be really too simple to say that the Constitution sort of follows the economy.
I just want to also share just a little something. If you didn't catch, there was a little point, a big point actually, in Professor Tribe's talk where he talked about Citizens United. And Citizens United is the recent case, really, where the Supreme Court said that corporations could support a candidate. And they couldn't contribute. Yeah. And you can just contribute.
Well, they haven't quite gotten to the contribution point yet. Give them a year or two,
Okay.
and they will. But they've said that corporations can spend limitless amounts of money promoting or opposing a candidacy. Because even though, despite what our friend, the former Governor Romney said, even though corporations are not entirely people, nonetheless, the freedom of speech applies regardless of who the speaker is. So even if E.T. suddenly came down and started babbling, and if the government wanted to muzzle E.T. and said, you're not a person, you can't speak, that would be a problem under the First Amendment. So the amendment that I'm proposing is not one that says corporations are suddenly going to be subject to censorship. I wouldn't want a system where the government could tell media or other corporations, no, you have to support government policy, you can't oppose it. But I do think that the idea that corporations, which through their general treasuries can amass massive amounts of money, should have the same right as you or I do, or Lenore, to pour money into various campaigns is problematic. That's what the Supreme Court, nonetheless, 5-4, held in Citizens United.
Please.
Kathleen Quill, Emmanuel, class 1945. I'm wondering if you would be willing to comment on Obama then and now. I'm surprised at all the negativity. I heard somebody, I don't remember who, said, well, you voted for Obama before to prove you weren't racist. Now vote against him to prove you're not crazy.
Well, that doesn't sound like, whoever said that obviously has a strong point of view about Obama. Obama then was a very brilliant, very pragmatic guy, very much a centrist. Obama during the campaign, as I heard it, maybe I was hearing it through ears that were conditioned by the Obama I knew, was pragmatic and centrist but filled with hope. Obama now is somebody who's become even more of a realist. He's learned that there are less things that he can do against some people that others would call crazy than he had hoped. I wish he had learned the lessons a little more quickly. I do think it's possible that he, if he is reelected, would be a more effective manager of the White House and a more effective leader. I think it's easy to downplay the things he's accomplished, the kind of depression we might have had but for the bailout. What would have happened to Detroit but for what he did with the auto industry? It's easy to forget the importance of ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It's easy to forget the importance of a lot of the things he did, but he came in with such enormous expectations that it's very easy for people to say, oh God, you know, this is no Messiah. Well, he never thought he was a Messiah, neither did I. And in the end, it's not just a referendum on Obama. It's a question of Obama versus X. It's a question of who X is and whether X has any beliefs at all. And if those beliefs are real, what would they mean for the economy? So it's a mixed bag for me.
John Paul.
My name is John Paul Sidner. I teach world religions here. I'm curious, given the significant number of progressive bills signed by FDR and then overturned by that Supreme Court, why did you mention in your lecture that you consider it unlikely that the universal health care will be overturned by this service?
I didn't say I thought it was unlikely. No, John Paul, I said I thought it might happen. I wasn't sure it would happen. I'm involved in sort of debating it all the time, not only against Epstein, but I'm having a debate before the Federalist Society, not necessarily the most friendly audience for the position that I would be advocating on November 12th against Paul Clement, who represents the 26 states that succeeded in having the 11th Circuit invalidate part, at least, of the statute. I think it's a closer question than I would like what the court will do. I think if you follow the precedents as they appear to me, it would require a fairly radical move to overturn the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. But this court has done some pretty radical things. It's not at all a restrained court. Citizens United overturned, nearly a century of law about corporations. So I think it's a very open question, and in a way, it's a blockbuster case. It's probably the most important case of the decade, certainly the most important since Bush v. Gore, and there's no question the court will take it up. They might kick it down the road a little because there are jurisdictional issues. There's something called the Anti-Injunction Act, which in the view of one court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, means that you cannot challenge the penalties that might be imposed on people for not buying the insurance that they could afford to buy until the penalties have been imposed, that you can't have a pre-enforcement challenge. That would be kind of a cool way for the court to say, we'll take it up in a couple of years, but they might take it up more fully now.
I'm the husband of a graduate from 1947. Speaking about the presidents that we get or we don't get, can you comment on the Bush-Gore decision of the Supreme Court?
What would make you think I'd have anything to say about that? Yeah, I was not happy with it. I want to say that there were two Bush-Gore decisions. The one that I argued and didn't exactly lose. The court kicked the case back to the Florida Supreme Court, the one that I argued. Florida Supreme Court thumbed its nose at the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court asked the Florida Supreme Court to explain what the hell it was doing. Was it changing the rules? And the court just sat on it. In the meantime, the court got a second case, which David Boies argued, and I think partly affected by the sense that it had been snubbed by the Florida Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court, I think, reacted by saying, whatever is going on down there isn't healthy. They're looking at these hanging chads. That's not the way for a democracy to pick a president. And so they looked for some doctrinal way to justify what they were doing. I'm not one of those, like my colleague Alan Dershowitz and a few others who says they were corrupt. They just wanted Bush to be the president, not Gore. Nonsense. That's not what they were doing. For one thing, they're smart enough to know that Bush would have become the president anyway. A, there's about a 50% chance that a full recount would have come out Bush's way rather than Gore's. And B, even if it didn't, the laws of the republic say that when there are two competing slates for president, The tie is broken by the governor of the state. Now, guess who was the governor of Texas? It was Jeb Bush. So George Bush was going to win that one anyway. And the decision might, in the very long run, have some positive impact, because the idea, the general idea, that you've got to have some uniform standards for counting votes, that's not so bad in a country where we can't seem to figure out how to count ballots. So someday Bush v. Gore might do some good.
Yes, I was just going to say, please.
I'm looking at I'm Kathy Bucher. I'm a sociologist. I have two questions, but I will just ask one and maybe ask you this. I'm familiar. To what extent do you think that the challenge to the Obama health care plan is an issue of constitutionality versus the fiscal situation?
No question, it's a serious constitutional challenge. In fact, there are 4 or 5 serious constitutional challenges. They're not just made up. I mean, one of them is, do the precedents allow the Congress to go so far as to make somebody buy a product that he or she doesn't want? If I had 25 minutes, I could explain why I think the answer to that is yes, but it's not obvious. Second question is, does Congress have the power, by using its fiscal authority, the authority to withhold Medicaid money, does it have the power to make states change their Medicaid programs? There are important precedents, the so-called anti-commandeering cases, that limit the power of Congress to basically pressure the states. The third issue is whether Congress has the power to treat states in their capacity as employers when they cover or don't cover their employees, the same way it treats private employees. The Supreme Court, back in a case in 1976 called National League of Cities, had said, no, states as employers in certain of their functions are entitled to special treatment. Then, a few years later, the court overturned that 5-4, but 2 justices, O'Connor and Rehnquist, said, this doesn't make sense in our republic. You just wait, we'll be back. And their time may now have come. There's also, so if the thing is rife, you could teach a whole year of constitutional law from this one case. So it's not just about policy objections, although certainly what motivates a lot of people to push hard against it may be a disagreement with policy, a belief that it will be bad for our fiscal situation.
Lisa, and then we'll go to the back and over to the side. I'm sorry.
Lisa Stepanski, I'm in the English department. I think you're secretly an English professor, so anytime you want to come to the English department, it's all about interpretation.
Well, supposedly as a university professor, I can teach.
Well, I want to invite you. You're welcome to do that. Because there's so many students here, I'm fascinated by your personal biography that you started out in math, and that, you know, and here you are talking about the Constitution. We're a liberal arts college. I wondered if you might just kind of comment a little about your academic trajectory to our students here, about kind of how you kind of got here and what the liberal arts seem to have given you in your career.
Well, if I had studied only math, and if I had never studied literature and philosophy and history, I would have been up the creek without a paddle. I mean, it would have been tough, because math is lovely, it's beautiful. I still love its abstraction, its precision, it's all about structure, and it helped me in a lot of ways that have nothing to do with mathematics. So I'm not saying that the decision your president made to reinstate the math major some 39 years ago was a mistake. It's important. Math is critical. In fact, it's part of what makes me a better lawyer and legal thinker, but it's also critical to have a liberal arts education. I wish I knew more history. I mean, I'm constantly saying, God, I don't know about this, I don't know about that aspect of American history, European history. So one thing that I would really recommend that everyone do, English, critical, absolutely critical, because you've got to know how to talk, you've got to know how to write, you have to know how to express yourself. But history and philosophy are also critical. So is math. I mean, it's hard to know what to omit. I so envy those of you who are still in college. I mean, you've got this cornucopia of stuff, all these things you can learn. It's wonderful. You've got to have fun too, but learning has to be made enjoyable.
And the most enjoyable is political science.
Oh, I didn't mean to leave that out.
Okay, I promise to look at this side. Please, you've had your hand up for such a long time.
Andrew, I'm wondering, do you feel like this constitutional debate could breed discontent, which would lead to violence?
But whether the current debate about the Constitution would lead to violence?
Yeah, almost.
Well, there's only so much frustration that people will take. The Arab Spring is something that is not necessarily limited to the Middle East. You see relatively peaceful, polite protests on Wall Street now. They could become more serious because unemployment levels in the United States are staggering, and certainly among minority communities, they are shameful. So I'm somewhat surprised sometimes that people are willing to take it lying down. But I don't think it's the constitutional debates that would lead to violence. If anything, the constitutional debates are a safety valve. They're a way that people who think that the system is not working for them can be challenged. The Constitution gives you a language through which to challenge the way those who hold power are exercising it. So it's in some ways an antidote to violence.
Okay, we have a couple of more hands, so why don't, and I know the time is 3 hands, so I'm actually going to take the 3 questions and have Professor Tribe. So there was one here, please, and one back there. You've been very patient, by the way, and there's someone over there and there. Is there anyone else? Up 4. Okay, we'll take those. Please.
Freedom of speech. Do you think the founders meant when the word speech, the term speech, would be expanded to be like freedom of expression, like burning the flag, for example, and other things?
Well, a lot of people.
1 minute. Should we
Oh, you want to hear? I'll answer them all after we've heard them all, okay?
Okay, thank you.
But I may forget.
I have it.
Okay.
I was just wondering, what did you think of the Patriot Act and that a lot of those measures are still existing, and do you think that they'll remain, or do you think that they'll be gone soon?
So flag burning, speech, Patriot Act.
I said somebody else. Yeah, please.
I wanted to know how people like the Tea Party movement can justify paying less taxes constitutionally when our taxes pay for our representation and our political voice.
Anybody? Please.
If there were a new constitutional convention, wouldn't that completely delegitimize the Supreme Court itself?
Okay, let me ask them answer in reverse order. I have no idea what a new constitutional convention would do because we haven't had one since 1787, and what it would legitimate or delegitimate is up for grabs. One of the reasons I'm worried about it is that we have no idea what its agenda would be, who could control it, whether it could, strip the court of the power of judicial review. As far as the Patriot Act is concerned, it's a huge statute. There are all kinds of parts of it that are not really objectionable from a civil libertarian's point of view, at least not this civil libertarian. There are other parts of it that I think arguably do go too far, and I don't know that I can help sort it out, but I think the support for it, the political support in the post-9/11 atmosphere, is so overwhelming that it keeps getting renewed with almost no debate. Now, as far as speech and flag burning is concerned, probably the framers didn't expect flag burning to be covered, but also the authors of the 14th Amendment didn't expect schools to get desegregated. Most people, including Justice Scalia, the people who believe original meaning counts, recognize that it's not what the authors expected. It's not what was going on in their brains that become the law. It's what they wrote and what it means. And Scalia, who's one of the ones who said that much as he hates flag burners, he thinks they're protected by the First Amendment, by freedom of speech, has reasoned, just as I have, and just as Justice Kennedy, who's also a conservative, has reasoned that it's not so much the flag burning that's protected, it's the message of protest. And we best protect the American flag by protecting those whose feelings are so strong that they would even burn the flag to express them. The way those laws are written, if you burn the flag respectfully as part of the burial of a soldier, for example, you're not punished. It's only if you burn it as a way of saying, F you to the national government. And that's why it's really speech that's being punished in the flag burning cases. As far as the idea of taxes and the Tea Party are concerned, certainly there's nothing under the existing law that would justify someone saying, I won't pay my taxes because I don't like what the government does with them. But also there's nothing in the Constitution that says to the Tea Partier that he or she can't exercise his freedom of speech to say that much of what we're doing with tax money is wrong and we ought to lower our tax rates. So there's a big difference between advocating lowering taxes, which is perfectly within their right, and simply refusing to pay your taxes as a form of protest, which I think is not. Is that all of them?
That's it. You're amazing. there is a wonderful reception prepared for us over at the Fenway Room, the first floor of the administration building. Professor Tribe will be there, and we would love a chance to talk to you on a more personal level. Thank you.
It was fun.
Thank you. You were great. You were great. Unbelievable. You're unbelievable.
Thank you.
Students who are asking the final questions is amazing.
Good.
That's why you're an amazing teacher.
Thank you so much.
And wonderful.
Thank you.
Let Professor Tribe in the middle.
What should we do?
We're just going to have a picture taken.